Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining Voting for Generational Fairness, What You Need to Know, a webinar hosted by Generation Squeeze today. My name is Brianna Workman. I'm the Manager of Government Policy at a firm called Impact Public Affairs based out of Ottawa, and we have the very great pleasure of working in collaboration with Generation Squeeze. As you may know, Generation Squeeze recently put out their Voters Guide, which is available at generationsqueeze.ca/vote21, which focuses on 4 evergreen topics: housing, family affordability, climate change, and budgets for well-being. That is the focus of the Voters Guide, which is also the focus of today's discussion. Before we jump into it, just a few housekeeping reminders. This webinar will use the Q&A function on Zoom, so please feel free to submit any questions you have via that function at the bottom of your Zoom screen today. We'll get to as many questions as time allows. There is also a chat function as well, which you can use to share commentary or general resources, but we do ask that you keep your uses of the Q&A and the chat to topics relevant to today's discussion. Another reminder that this event is being recorded and will be shared via Generation Squeeze's platforms following today's webinar. It will also be sent out to all registrants if anyone didn't have a chance to tune in today. With that, it's my very great pleasure to introduce Dr. Paul Kershaw, who is the founder of Generation Squeeze, a policy professor at UBC's School of Population and Public Health, and the director of UBC's Masters of Public Health program. So over to you, Paul, for a quick brief introduction.
Oh, thanks for that intro. And before I go any further, let me acknowledge that today I'm coming to you from the ancestral, unceded traditional territory of the Katzie people. That's at the confluence of the Pitt and Fraser Rivers in beautiful British Columbia, where on colonized maps, we now call it Pitt Meadows. I self-identify as someone who's a homeowner, and we're going to be talking about housing policy today. And I'm going to acknowledge that I've actually had my house go up in wealth a great deal. And that means that as a homeowner in unceded territory, my interaction with the legacy of colonization is fraught. And I encourage all of us, wherever we are joining this webinar today from, to think about the responsibilities that we have to promote truth and reconciliation.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Paul, for that. And so with that, we'll jump right into today's discussion because we do know we have lots to cover and an hour will go by quickly. So we want to thank everyone, first of all, who submitted questions in advance of the event. They have helped inform the questions that I will pose to Paul as part of the moderated format of the discussion. And also we'll continue to incorporate those throughout the discussion. So like I said, please feel free to use the Q&A as Paul and I chat, and we'll be a bit fluid. We do have the different sections we want to go through, but it doesn't mean we can't jump back and forth if needed between different topic areas. So we will kick off with our very first topic area, which is about housing. But just before we do, to set the stage a little bit, Paul, could you just give us a quick primer on what is Generation Squeeze and how have you and your team put together the 2021 Voters Guide?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. So Generation Squeeze, in a nutshell, is a force for intergenerational fairness, intending to improve Canada's well-being, powered by the voices of younger Canadians and those who are older who love us, all backed by cutting-edge research. And one of the ways in which we try and be a force for intergenerational fairness is to try and influence the decisions of our governments at important political moments. Elections are one of them. And so we put in a great deal of effort to study the platforms and help young and old alike assess the degree to which the platforms are going to promote a range of important goals related to housing, family affordability, climate change, and generally promoting well-being in society. So we've looked at over 60 different criteria for the 4 major parties in Canada that are offering platforms and candidates across the country and that already have at least one MP in the House of Commons. And in light of the evidence, we then go about looking at each of those 60-ish criteria and then provide a range of summaries, including a little scorecards that can kind of show you the horse race relative to the goals that we're trying to achieve. And I really encourage people to look at the sort of the gap often between where the parties are at and the distance toward the goal. Because one of the key things that Gen Squeeze doesn't do is endorse any particular party. What we're trying to help people do is feel confident when they go to the ballot box. We don't care how you vote, but we want you to have a better sense of how are the platforms aligning with the evidence about what will solve housing affordability, family affordability, climate change, and promote well-being from the early years onwards.
Amazing. Thanks, Paul. So with that, let's dive into housing, which I know has been an incredibly hot topic in this election in particular. And I think more and more Canadians are really feeling the effects of the housing crisis, particularly in the last few years, which is why we're hearing so much about this from all parties in this election. So why is housing affordability so out of reach for younger Canadians? Is it this old adage about, younger Canadians are just not budgeting properly or spending too much money on things like avocado toast or lattes, or is what's really this broader system-wide issue that we're seeing, and how did it become the current crisis that it is?
Oh, that's a great question. Let's just put to bed the idea that it's the avocado toast and the coffee drinking.
I agree.
Those are just crazy myths that we use in society right now to undermine the influence and power of younger Canadians, to make people feel like they somehow are individually failing when there's actually a systemic problem at play. And 1 second, how did I just put my hand up? A systemic problem at play. And by that, I mean, over the last several decades, what we've done is we've had our housing system squeeze as much wealth out of it as is possible for those who got into the market as homeowners some time ago. Full disclosure, I'm one of those people. I've been a homeowner for over the decade. But while we've been squeezing that much wealth out for those who got in the system some time ago, we've been leaving so much less affordability for those who follow in our footsteps. And that, I would argue, is sort of the primary problem that has given rise to just a massive gap. Home prices going like this, earnings, especially for young people, flattened down. And as we've been assessing the platforms, we've been looking for whether or not parties would do one of three big things: scale up the below market housing or the not-for-profit housing sector, because more people are going to continue to rely on the not-for-profit sector to make a home, but simultaneously fix the regular market, because the majority of Canadians, no matter what, are going to need to rely on that regular market to make a home, either as a renter or an owner. And most importantly, I think, break our cultural and political addiction to high and rising home prices. We have to right now go ahead and start saying, in order to restore affordability for all, we need home prices to stall so that earnings can catch up. And one of the fundamental weaknesses of all four major party platforms is none of them expressly commit to that idea.
Thanks, Paul. And so you mentioned, home prices needing to stall so earnings can catch up, but what are other things that government intervention and the right policy decisions can do to really make affordable housing a reality in Canada?
Well, if we don't keep our eye on that larger price, it's kind of the metaphor I would use is that there's this escalator, and the escalator is going up really, really fast. That's what's happening with rents and home prices. And the party leaders are genuinely promising to run down that escalator faster than they've done before. The party platforms are better on housing than they were in 2019 and in previous years. That's the good news. But they can't run down fast enough if they don't start slowing the escalator. And so that it has to be our overarching goal, because there's no silver bullet. But as I've said in multiple interviews, there's silver buckshot. We've identified about 15 categories of action items that parties need to take. And some of those fall under the category of like scaling up not-for-profit housing. The others are fixing the regular housing market. And then again, as I mentioned earlier, breaking our addiction. And you'll see different parties are doing some of those things. But if I count it all up, the Liberals, for instance, are about doing 2/3 of those action items. The Greens and the NDP about 1/3, and the Conservatives about 1/4. That's not a nonpartisan statement. That's not a partisan statement. You can use that information however you wish to when you're at the ballot box. But when thinking about who's really promising to use every tool in the toolbox right now, we don't have any party saying, I'm going to grab hold of all of them. And we have some saying we'll grab more of them than others.
And so just before we move on to what each party platform is offering, we do have a question from Kareem in the audience that says, is it realistic to think that home prices will eventually catch up? It says real wages haven't risen in nearly half a century. So is that a realistic thought when we talk about this issue?
Yeah, it's a really great question, and all the more reason why we have to think about having home prices stall, because earnings have been flat, and for younger folks, they actually are down after inflation, if you compare it to when my mom started out in the housing market some decades ago. And so it is the case that it's not going to be just 1 year of catching up that we'll do, or 2 years. We need to talk about home prices stalling probably until 2030, and give ourselves the best part of a decade to allow earnings slowly but surely, hopefully, to make some inroads, and help us then signal that we're going to break this addiction to high and rising home prices, so that we encourage Canadians to anticipate that when we're planning for our retirement, planning for our savings down the road, that we're going to look for vehicles outside of housing. Because at bottom, we're only going to solve this problem if we prioritize housing being for homes first and investments second. And for the last couple of decades for sure, people have been wanting two things from housing: a place to call home and a good investment return. But the moment it's a good investment return, we're having home prices rise faster than people's earnings. And that erodes most people's abilities to actually make a home if they're starting the housing system now.
Great. And so we've touched on it a little bit in some of the previous answers, but what are the parties offering in terms of action on housing? And, what are the points of convergence and some of the differences between the platforms?
Yeah, so you'll hear most parties talk about they're going to produce a number of homes, or they're going to help stimulate the building of a number of homes. And you might have heard the Liberals talk about 1.4 million homes, the Conservatives 1 million, the NDP 500,000. And when you think about those numbers, you're like, how different are they? The numbers aren't that different, but in terms of how quickly they're going to get homes built, I think that's what the evidence will show, but their emphasis is a bit different. So it is the case that the NDP seem to be disproportionately emphasizing building not-for-profit housing. And before they put out their costed platform just on the weekend, it was hard to tell how urgent they were going about that. It seems like they're going to do that more urgently than the other parties at this stage. The Conservatives, they talk a lot about human rights, but they don't have language about the right to housing. And so as a result, they have a correspondingly smaller emphasis on scaling up the not-for-profit market. That's not a big part of their platform at all. The Conservatives tend more about how they're going to scale up in the regular market. They do ambitiously talk about building more purpose-built rental around where we can plan for transit, et cetera. That's a good idea. That's not a new idea, but it's great to see the party embrace it. You'll see that idea, I think, percolate through some of the other parties. The Liberals, because they've been in power now for the last 6 years, they started off more with a focus on the not-for-profit sector, but in more recent years, they too are trying to build more units in the quote-unquote regular market. And so that's why the Liberals are scoring a little bit ahead in terms of using more of the clusters of action items that we're talking about needing to happen. Remember, there's 15, and we're saying the Liberals are doing about 2/3. And that's because there's a little more balance in the Liberals platform about doing in the regular market and the not-for-profit market by comparison with some of the other parties. And so, one other thing, a lot of talk has come around, like some of the examples of dialing down harmful demand for housing. And so the Conservatives, they actually were interesting. They were bold and said, hey, we're going to have a 2-year moratorium on foreign buyers purchasing residential real estate, unless they're actually just trying to invest in building new purpose-built rental. That was new and audacious, I would say, in the political landscape in Canada. The Liberals have since matched. The NDP on that front are tending to focus more on replicating something we've had in BC and Ontario, which is a foreign buyer's tax. It looks like the Liberals and Conservatives are trying to be a bit bolder on that issue right now than the NDP. Something else bold on trying to dial down some examples of harmful demand are people who are like buying homes and trying to flip them really quickly. Here, the Liberals, for the first time, and they're the only party promising to do this, would say, hey, we're going to try and discourage that by making it less profitable for people to treat housing as an investment rather than a place to call home. I think that's kind of exciting. And I guess one last piece that's worth recognizing between the parties is there's a number of people on this call who are probably wanting to be first-time home buyers. And there is a difference in the approach that the parties are offering to helping first-time home buyers. And this really matters because the demand of first-time home buyers is a double-edged sword. Individuals want to get in the housing market, but if they contribute to bidding up home prices, then we just erode affordability for those who follow in their footsteps. So the NDP and the Conservatives on this issue are trying to come up with ways to help a younger demographic deal with this crushing gap between high home prices and local earnings by borrowing more. So the NDP say, let's have a longer mortgage. The Conservatives do the stress test. We're getting into the weeds here, but borrowing more sort of the approach. That's a bit risky because the moment we allow people to borrow more, the better positioned they are to bid up those home prices, which drives the prices out of reach further. By contrast, the Liberals are trying not to encourage borrowing more in some ways. They're trying to encourage younger folks to save more. So they've created this kind of interesting fusion of an RSP and a tax-free savings account for the first $40,000 that people might be able to cobble together to put toward a down payment. I think there's more safety for a housing system by encouraging people to save more rather than borrow more. But also it's worth pointing out the Liberals ultimately are looking to allow people to borrow and insure a mortgage for over $1.2 million, which we've never done before. So there's an inconsistency in the Liberal logic on that part of their platform.
Great. And actually, some of your last comments there just reminded me to pull a question that we actually received in advance in registration, which asks us to comment a little bit on the effect of increasing personal debt and government equity in the market. And so the question is really, how do the Liberals and the NDP compare on the amount of personal debt they're trying to pass off to the next generation in some of their housing proposals?
Yeah, so this goes back directly to my last comments about the difference
Mhm.
between helping people borrow more versus save more. And so I think that in this case, the Liberals are trying, when they talk to first-time home buyers, to be more careful on this issue. Like, don't become over-leveraged. So that's why they have the savings account. They also had, they're continuing with something called the First-Time Home Buyers Initiative, which is like a shared equity approach. So the federal government is willing to partner with first-time home buyers for 5 or 10% of the value of the home, so that the owner doesn't have to take on as much equity or much debt, I should say. And if the home prices go down, well, then the federal government will share in some of the cost of it going down. If it goes up, the federal government will share in some of the profits that come from that. And so you do see a policy difference on that issue. But more generally, you don't have either of these parties saying, hey, we need to have home prices stall to restore affordability for all. And that is a common problem that we really, once this election is over, need to overcome, because we can't solve this housing crisis if we don't actually get to that high level of what do we want from our housing system? Do we want housing prices to be the way that we grow our economy? Maybe it grows our GDP, but it is absolutely hurting hard work paying off for young people, because it takes years more work to save a down payment or to pay that rent when you can't, because your consolation prize is rising rents, if we keep allowing GDP to be driven by these rising home prices. And so now is the time to say, let's go beyond GDP. It's too blunt to measure. Let's measure our economic prosperity. And like, does it take more or less work to cover our major cost of living? And is this economy sustainable? That has to be, I think, the new criteria going forward.
Absolutely. And I know that'll come up in other parts of our discussion today as well, and some of our other topics. But just one question that came in advance, as well as one that's just come in live from Danny. One question we received in advance was on the role of provincial governments in the housing crisis, as well as Danny asks what the role of municipal government and zoning bylaws is on this issue, and how it kind of interacts with the federal government strategies. So could you comment on how municipal and provincial governments are involved in this as well?
Yeah, really quickly, because I know we're going to want to transition on to some other themes. So let's be clear. There is no silver bullet to solve the housing affordability crisis, and that reflects that no one level of government can do it. So we need to have the federal government be thinking about how its jurisdictional responsibilities overlap with the provinces and the municipalities. I think one important thing that I'm excited to be seeing in multiple platforms, here the Liberals and the Conservatives stand out in this way. I'd have to double check right now with the NDP, but they're talking about how can they use investments from the federal government to incentivize municipalities to add density. And they've expressly mentioned that we need to counter NIMBYism, because at a local municipal level, you'll often have people say, don't put that rental in my neighborhood, put it somewhere else. Everyone likes rental, and then suddenly, but when it's potentially adapting their neighborhood, they're less keen on it. And that's resulting in a lot of our land being underutilized. We have lots of neighborhoods that have low levels of density, when we do need to be adding the right kind of supply, rentals with multiple bedrooms, et cetera. And so I'm excited to be seeing a couple of federal parties expressly talking about how they're going to use infrastructure transfers or transit payments or housing investments to say, hey, municipality, if you want the largest share of this federal investment, you're going to need to meet some density targets. There's details to work out about how they'll make that happen in our federalism system, but I think it's the right thing to be considering at this moment, given the urgency of the housing and affordability crisis.
Great, thanks, Paul. And so we'll move into our second section now on family affordability. I know there is an additional question on housing, so we'll loop back if we have a chance later, but just to keep moving along, I'm going to pose you a first question on childcare. We know childcare is one component of family affordability in Generation Squeeze's analysis of the platforms, but it's certainly one that's top of mind in this election and has been discussed, particularly since Budget 2021 was dropped in April. So first question is, when it comes to childcare, some parties are promising money to the provinces, around this $10 a day for childcare framework, and some are promising a tax credit to Canadians. What's the difference between those different mechanisms?
Oh, it's such a big difference. And I'm pretty confident I saw that people registering for today included colleagues from the $10 a day campaign. So I just want to give a shout out to the impressive work that they've done, helping to lead on this change in British Columbia, which is now spreading across the country, around ensuring that childcare costs no more than $10 a day, which would mean it would no longer be a mortgage or rent size payment. So the question is, can investing in that approach be rivaled by a tax credit? And the answer to that is unequivocally no. And I can give you at least 4 reasons for that. 1, the amount of money that the tax credit will ultimately spend is a small, tiny fraction of what we're talking about when investing in building a system of $10 a day childcare. And so just the amount of money's ability to deliver reductions in childcare costs for most families is just tiny for the tax credit approach. I think the amount that conservatives in this case are proposing doesn't even count as a rounding error on the federal budget a few years from now. But in addition, the tax policy, we've been relying on a kind of similar childcare expense deduction for some time in this country, and it doesn't do the following. It doesn't ensure that the childcare providers disproportionately women are getting paid pay equity level wages. It doesn't ensure that we have high quality care because we have, an adequate number of care providers and early educators relative to the number of kids in the childcare setting. And the combination of those two things then really starts to raise questions about, are we getting kids off to the best start possible when they're in that childcare setting, knowing that childcare never replaces what parents do at home, but it's critical for supplementing what they do because more and more people need dual parent households, lone parent households in the labor market to fend off the high costs of housing. So punchline, if you don't want childcare to be another rent-size payment, there are three parties that are putting forward enough money to bring into reality a $10 a day childcare system. It won't happen overnight. It will require a little bit of patience, but the plan is to make substantial savings into people's daily childcare costs even a few months from now. And so that is a historic thing. We've been talking about it since the 1970 Royal Commission on the Status of Women. As a boy, I will say I'm embarrassed it took men a long time to figure out that this was an important enough issue to invest historically in, and three of the four parties are doing that. If you're looking for which party has the most detail in their plans, I think the fairest assessment would be because the Liberal Party is already in government, they've been working with the provinces to establish aid agreements already with the provinces. There's more detail there, but I think that the dollars invested by the NDP and Green are also sufficient to make it happen.
Yes, and I think you're so right, Paul. Just such a historic investment, as well as just at such an important time, talking about COVID and coming out of a COVID-induced recession, what that means for the workforce and for our country. That childcare is such an important investment in that context, but also one that's been a long time coming. But we know that.
Brianna, I think that's really clever. I think actually you're so smart to just emphasize that. I mean, the pandemic will have caused so much harm over the last 18 months, including because childcare has started to become more challenging to manage for many parents who are losing access to it and then shifting home and working from home and becoming the employee and the teacher and the childcare worker and the best friend of their kids simultaneously. Talk about role overload. I take my hat off to every one of the people on the call right now who was managing all of that. But one thing is it did underscore how important childcare was for our economy. I do think there's a link between the pandemic and finally political parties saying they're going to invest historically on this. And so when we reflect back in the years ahead, the pandemic will have very few silver linings, but its motivation for actually making childcare in this country happen will be maybe one of them.
Absolutely.
Sorry to cut you off there. I just thought that was such a clever
okay. It was a great
point.
thought. I just was looking, I saw a question pop up. Just looking here. So someone asked AMC, wouldn't a tax credit also set up the system to become quickly ineffective? The credit does nothing to control the cost of childcare. All it does is provide a small discount, while childcare facilities themselves can inflate their fees, essentially negate the initial intent of making childcare affordable. So would you like to expand on that point?
I think AMC just nailed it. And so that is another way in which the tax approach has not proven over the last several decades to be a system building approach, and does lend itself to providers of childcare, especially when they're in commercial settings, to just inflate their fees to match the most recent increase to the tax credit or deduction.
Absolutely. And as with other points, happy to circle back to childcare, but just to shift gears quickly within the family affordability context, beyond childcare, what else can parties do to make having a family more affordable for Canadians?
At Gen Squeeze, we tend to focus on three things. So childcare is a key one, and happily we see some serious progress on this amongst multiple parties for the first time. We also have historically looked at parental leave and how to improve that. And it's really interesting to me that parental leave is literally almost lost in the dialogue this year. There's some vague references in a couple of party platforms, but with no money really attached to them. And so with leave, what we need to recognize is the following. When people go on leave, they are still taking like rent size hits to their earnings because it happens to the employment insurance system. And there's a big chunk of change that families will forgo when parents take it. When they take it, it tends to incentivize often the lower earner to take longer leaves. And in our country context, where we still have a gender pay gap, it's often incentivizing women to take longer leaves. And one of the things that actually frustrates me a little bit about parental leave policy is some years ago, we were pushing hard at like extending leave from a year to 18 months. And the Liberals did pick that up and they've made that change. But we were arguing for the leave benefits to become more generous, to incentivize dads to get more involved, and to ensure we never raised any infants in poverty. And the way that the Liberals have put this in previous years did not do that very effectively. And it's making it more complicated now to fix. And unfortunately, none of the parties are actually really talking about fixing it. I'll cut them some slack though, because the childcare debate's so darn historic. But immediately after the election, and we're making some progress on childcare, we're going to want to go back and say, yeah, we need families to be able to afford enough time in the labor market, but also enough time at home, and especially following the birth of the baby. It's the both and approach. And on that last theme, we need to start talking more generally in this country about facilitating work-life balance. Our employment standards, which are focused around, people working around 40 hours a week as full-time work, they were established some decades ago, often when it was assumed there was going to be a one earner couple. And typically, the stereotypical guy was working and mom was staying at home. We don't live in that world any longer. Now we have both parents often working. So you've got households not giving around 40 hours a week, but like 75, 80 hours a week. That's a massive time loss at home. And in a context where people are living longer lives, like young people are living 7 to 10 years longer than when we first started our retirement income policies back in the day, we likely need to talk about how do we spread our work better over our lives so that we can achieve better work-life balance each week and year, but possibly start talking about actually working more years over our lives because we're living longer. That will actually frustrate some young people, like, why do I have to work longer? But if we're going to manage the finances of the country, and retirement income policy is a big chunk of that tax dollars that we contribute on a day in, day out basis, right now it's creating a big hole in our budget. They're causing deficits. And if we as a generation, or generations of younger people in their prime childbearing and rearing years, don't think about how we can get a win-win of better work-life balance now and going forward year over year, but then thinking about how we can make sure that we're working enough years that we all can have adequate income security in our retirement, and make sure that we're having the tax dollars there available to float the boats of those most risk in retirement. So that was it's a larger conversation. None of the parties are really getting into this, but when we get back to the work of trying to influence policy after an election, that'll be a theme. I think we need to start saying time is money. And Gen squeezers are typically, squeezed by lower earnings and higher costs. But if we can't figure out a way to ensure that time, especially time at home, time out of the labor market, isn't always the collateral damage, we are going to miss something that makes this country have the potential to make people well and happy and healthy.
Absolutely. And I think just to add the lens of kind of the moment we're in right now in this election, and as a country and as a world, I think that aspect of work-life balance is something that's become even more blurred for some folks in the context of the pandemic. I think working from home has its benefits, and some people really enjoy those benefits, but I do think it's made even more of a challenge to have those really separate work-life boundaries. And I think talking about mental health and well-being as we come out of what has been this extreme challenge that has weighed on all of us and our families in different ways, but in equally difficult ways, I think sometimes is something that we have to have that broader conversation about as well.
Couldn't agree more. Well said.
Absolutely. So with that, we'll shift gears a little bit again towards climate change. And so here, every platform has committed in some respect to carbon pricing in this election. So what is the difference when we look at carbon pricing policy among the parties when they're all committing to this in some form?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me just back up a little bit, because I want to say, hey, we do have more convergence in our country in this election about the importance of climate change than we have had in the past. That's really exciting. I think that's actually motivating your question. So how do they differ? Well, I think there's there's multiple important differences, but let's start at the highest level. So there's a bit of a difference about just how bold people are trying to be in the short term to reduce our carbon footprint as a country. And here you have to continue to give the Green parties the credit for having the most ambitious objective. They're aiming to try to reduce our carbon footprint as a country by 60% below 2005 levels by 2030. The NDP and the Liberals are talking about doing closer to 50%. There's some debate whether Canada can actually achieve the 60%, but you have to give credit. The Greens are wanting us to be that urgent. And it matters because that sets us up on the best, on the pathway that's especially likely to get us not only to net zero by 2050, which everyone is saying is just critical for ensuring that the planet doesn't grow warmer than 1.5 degrees, which is really going to put in jeopardy the things that our planet requires to allow human beings to be healthy and well. But so the Greens are going to be doing that probably with the greatest urgency, although there are questions about how they can do it. And then this comes down to the next level about the platforms, who's offering the most detail. The Green platform is actually short on details this year, in particular, compared to previous years. I think that reflects some challenges the party is having more generally. People would have been hearing about that in the news. In terms of the level of detail, again, reflecting the privilege of being an incumbent government, the Liberals have more details, which will then bring me into your question about the actual carbon pricing. I think the NDP, the Greens, and the Liberals are all talking about putting a price on pollution that will raise it over the next decade at 2 levels that is in line with what the research says we need to do to incentivize our economy to transition towards a net zero future. Happily, the Conservatives are now agreeing that carbon pricing matters. So kudos to them. But the price that they're committing to put on it will stall at, and then we're in the weeds, $50 a ton. And that is much lower than any other party and not consistent with how much we need to put a price on pollution over the next decade. So punchline, 3 parties are proposing to put a high and rising price commensurate with what the evidence is calling to transition us to a net zero economy in the years ahead. The Conservatives have introduced a price, but not at a level high enough to create this incentive that the research is calling for, which is interesting for a party. Surprising. I mean, they're a party that wants to harness market incentives, but in this case, they're not wanting to harness as much as the other parties the market's power to incentivize us to shift away from pollution when we're still leaving, if not necessarily free, a very low price.
Absolutely. And we know that talking about, that goal of net zero by 2050 is a goal that requires a number of different policy interventions, and carbon pricing being one of them. But Generation Squeeze's analysis also touches on support for businesses as well as workers in making that transition towards a green economy. Could you comment on what's in the platform on some of those points for businesses and for workers as well?
Yeah, it is the case that we look at 24 clusters of action items for the climate change. So we did 15 for housing affordability, 24 for climate change. There's a dozen for family affordability. And when it comes to climate change for businesses, it actually picks up on my comment a moment ago about the pricing of pollution and the Conservatives. Are they harnessing the power of the market to help incentivize our change? And one place where the Conservatives are actually quite strong is they want to invest in more research and development about green technologies. And then they'll want to help us export that. So that's a place where the Conservatives are doing relatively well. But more generally, the Conservatives are not taking action to bake sustainability into our financial system or trying to get investors as excited as some other parties. On this front, when you get into the weeds, the details, it is the case that the Liberals are talking more about trying to bake sustainability into our financial system going forward. And I encourage you to go check out, there are pages of details in all of the platforms, but in this case, there's some really interesting things coming from the Liberals.
Amazing. And so how does the impacts of climate change squeeze younger Canadians even further down the road? We've talked about kind of the immediacy of the housing crisis, and there's certainly lots of immediacy to climate change as well. But what are some of the long-term impacts of this for particularly young Canadians?
Yeah, well, climate change is the quintessential example of sort of a systemic intergenerational villain, where we have literally been over the last several decades, just as we've been absorbing so much wealth out of our housing system and leaving little affordability behind for those who follow, in our climate, we're taking up all of the atmosphere's scarce capacity to absorb carbon and then leaving little of that precious capacity behind. And it is the case that the World Health Organization, well before this pandemic and throughout the pandemic, will continue to tell us that the greatest risk to human health in the 21st century is climate change. And so we have already recognized, like for instance, with the heat dome in British Columbia, that you can see mortality rates rise in the moments of high and rising temperatures, and we saw many hundreds of deaths and over a short period of time in British Columbia, disproportionately in this case for seniors who, like children, are particularly vulnerable to those kinds of things. But more generally, if we are eroding the climate sustainability over time, we're eroding our ability to produce food. We are changing the way in which diseases are going to be operating in different national contexts. They're going to be spreading to places where they haven't been in the past. We're going to be disrupting economies, which means we're going to be disrupting people. That's going to start mass migrations, which are only going to be exacerbated as there's sea level rise, et cetera. So this is like existential. And it frustrates me that there is no party right now proposing to do all 24 of the action items that we need to take seriously to be trying to give ourselves the best chance to keep global temperatures no more than 1.5 degrees hotter by 2050. And because we're not taking that, we are not, treating this issue with the seriousness that it still requires. And so when you're thinking about the horse race, I can tell you that three parties are relatively close. You've got the Liberals doing about 70-ish% of those 24 action items. You've got the Green and the NDP doing more in the mid 60s. And then you still have the Conservatives doing better than in the past, but they fall a distant fourth compared to the other parties.
Amazing. And perhaps the last question I'll ask you on climate change for now, before we jump to budgets for well-being, is in Generation Squeeze's analysis, there is a section on carbon budgeting, which I found particularly interesting when I was taking a look. So I was wondering if you could just share with folks, what is carbon budgeting? How should it be done? And what, if at all, parties are talking about that in these election platforms?
Yeah, that's a great question. Then I'll actually add one other. It was a bit dire what I just said, so I want to say there is some positive convergence. So I'll give one other more hopeful thought about climate change. But in terms of carbon budgeting, this is really critical. If we're going to make the goal, if we're going to achieve the goal of net zero by 2050, then we need to be knowing how much of the atmosphere's scarce capacity absorbed carbon do we plan to use this year and the next year and all the years between now and 2050 when we think we're going to get to net zero emissions at that time. In other words, we need our governments to be just as judicious in spending our atmosphere's scarce capacity absorbed carbon as they are in reporting to us annually about how they plan to spend our tax dollars. Right now, we don't have carbon budgeting in this country in a formalized way. I'm happy to say that both the Greens and the NDP have formally committed to that idea. And the Liberals talk about having benchmarks over the next years, 2025, 2030, that could be transformed into carbon budgets, but they need to still be pushed a little bit further. Carbon budgeting doesn't yet get talked about by the Conservative Party, but I think that we could convince the Conservative Party that they're the kind of party that ideologically wants to think about, are we using tax dollars wisely? All the parties think that, but the Conservatives tend to try and emphasize that the most. So I think helping them be encouraged to think about, are they spending our atmosphere's scarce capacity wisely, and are we planning for that? That's something where I think we need to fuel more attention from the Conservative Party. But let me return also just to that more hopeful spot. I want to say that, there is some convergence around parties about how we're going to upgrade our lives in this country through a carbon makeover. We'll see parties, 3 or 4 parties consistently talk about saying in just a few short years, we could have 100% of our electricity produced from renewable sources. And you've got reasonable activity from all of the parties about how we're going to advance clean energy and clean industry. And we're going to move towards electrifying our transportation and zero emission homes and buildings, smarter land use. We do see progress. And so I don't want people to be too despondent when I said, my goodness, this is the greatest risk to human health in the 21st century. There's still room and time over the next decade for us to prioritize this issue to the level that we need to. And there is some evidence, especially around these ideas like upgrading our quality of life by moving towards cleaner sources of energy, that we're making some progress across the platforms. And that gives me hope for a kind of a nonpartisan position. When you have cross-party convergence, then you've got our culture shifting, and that is exciting.
Absolutely, I agree. And I think we'll see what happens next Monday, but particularly with the possibility of another minority parliament, those points of convergence are really great to see, because it's likely that might have to be the way they work in the House of Commons as well to get some initiatives forward, regardless of who may end up in government after next Monday. So moving on to our last section, and I will note, I do see a couple other questions trickling in on housing. So we'll wrap up our fourth section, and then I'll return to those additional housing questions after. But jumping into to budgets for well-being. And that's why I wanted to toss the carbon budgeting question as well to maybe flow into this a little bit, although they're slightly different. So Paul, can you tell us right off the bat, what is a well-being budget and why does it matter for young Canadians?
Yeah, this theme of well-being budgeting looks at two key questions. As a society, are our governments planning to prioritize investing in promoting well-being and promoting health, as opposed to waiting for people to fall sick and then treating illness after the fact? So do we prioritize health promotion over illness treatment? It's not like we don't need illness treatment, but it's the relative balance that we're looking for. And when you're interested in thinking about, are we promoting well-being and preventing illness, and that's going to have you bring a bit of a life course perspective. You can have you look at how are we spending across our lives and by age group, because you can prevent ill health more by starting with positive investments early in people's lives. So the second question is, are we spending urgently and fairly across age groups? And while we're looking at all that, we're simultaneously looking at, are we asking people to pay fairly for the things that we're asking for? So those are the themes that fall into well-being budgets. Promote well-being more than illness treatment, promote investment from the early years onward, raising revenue fairly from all age groups.
Fantastic. And so we've seen some people say, and some conversations in the debates, for example, last week, about rolling back support for seniors and pushing for austerity. Is that true? Does that have validity in the platforms as the analysis you've done?
Wow, I didn't expect that question. That's a good question. And the answer to that is no. And it sometimes frustrates me that when party leaders, or at least some of their candidates, are not aware of how their platforms are organized. They're all based on the existing federal budget, which is planning for a $19 billion annual increase to old age security alone by the time this next political mandate will end. That is that's the largest increase in the budget from anything that I can see. Similarly, we are already having plans that will grow spending for medical care for our aging population in important ways. Is it enough? We can have conversations about whether or not more is better, but what we aren't having enough conversation about is the relative balance. So I can show you two key data points from looking at all of the platforms. First, all of the platforms are promising to grow spending for every person over 65 4 to 5 times faster than they're proposing to increase spending for people under 45. That has, for instance, the Liberals, let's say, they're proposing to spend around $3,000 more per senior over the next several years, whereas they're only about $700 for each person under 45. That's including the new childcare money. Similar to the NDP, they wanted about $4,000 more spending per person over 65 and about $900 more spending per younger person. So actually growing the gap in spending between older and younger more than any party. The Conservatives, because they want to cut about $8 to $9 billion in spending on childcare, which is clearly something for younger generations. They're proposing only to increase spending on people under 45 by about $250 a year, and they're closer to like $2,500 to $3,000 per person over 65, because they're maintaining the increases to medical care and old age security for that group. So there's this tendency to let's get it right for my mom, who I love, and she may even be on this webinar right now. Hi, Mom, if you are. And we definitely need to protect my mom's demographic as they're experiencing the challenges that come with needing to access more medical care and to sustain an income after a career and into retirement. But I know my mom wants our governments and our parties that are running for office to leave a proud legacy for their kids and grandchildren, and to ensure that we're investing in the childcare, the post-secondary, the housing, the poverty reduction that really makes a difference. So that is the long and short about age issues. And more generally, I'll just say, because we might be running out of time here, it's clear that parties are disproportionately wanting to come out of the pandemic and be worried that our medical care system isn't shored up enough. And so they are talking more often about growing spending for medical care faster than they're growing spending in things like childcare and poverty reduction and housing and post-secondary. And that is a system of waiting to say we're going to spend quite a lot to treat people when they fall sick, as opposed to investing in the conditions into which people are born, grow, live, work, and age. Because it's those conditions where our health starts. Health doesn't start with medical care. It starts where we're born, grow, live, work, and age. And we're still a bit slow in this country to shift to prioritize promoting well-being faster than illness treatment. And there's a lot of reasons for that. We so define ourselves as being different from our neighbors to the south, in part because we have public medical care, and it occupies this great status in our cultural thinking about who we are. But unfortunately, that cultural status is increasingly having us move further away from what the research tells us is required to make us truly well and healthy. And we need to grow social spending faster, and the platforms are slow to do so.
Thanks, Paul. And I think your last comments there also just really tie together nicely all of the issues we've talked about today and why they are so intertwined for Generation Squeeze, because I think it just pulls it all together in a way that's so critical. We do have about 15 minutes left, so I'm going to jump into a few more audience questions that span across a few of the topics, housing and climate change primarily. I will just pull a recent one from David here that says they're curious about why we're framing the climate emergency around that 1.5 degrees Celsius when the IPCC recently announced that we're already quite locked into that warming. So why does the platform analysis still rate parties on that metric?
Yes, so we're agreeing with David. We're agreeing with David on this issue that it seems like that degree of warming is locked in. And what we're aiming to do is ask our parties to do all they can, both here in Canada and our fair share of Canada's role in the world, to try and not let it go much higher than that. And so we know that, the 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius is sort of that space. The closer we are to 1.5, the better. And so we are thinking that the pricing of pollution and the broader approaches to carbon budgeting need to be being as ambitious as they possibly can to keep us as close to 1.5 degrees as is possible.
Fantastic. And so, like I mentioned, there was a couple additional questions on housing, which I'm going to jump back towards. So another one from Kareem said, do you have any thoughts on mandating the central bank to account for the influence of their interest rate policy on the housing market explicitly, like was recently done in New Zealand, for example?
That's a really interesting and kind of technical question, Kareem. And so I can promise that coming out of the election, some of the next activities that Gen Squeeze is going to do is we're going to be providing some findings from a solutions lab that we've been running on housing, where monetary policy was one of the things under consideration from our working group. I think the long and the short of it would be, I absolutely believe we need to invite the Bank of Canada and the governments that are liaising with them to think about, yes, how do we use historically low interest rates to stimulate our economy as we're coming out of a recession? But there have to be ways that we can try and ensure that there's as little collateral damage to housing affordability as possible. And I think more attention can still be given to that. I think one of the ways that we might do that is inviting Statistics Canada to start measuring inflation with greater accuracy in relation to housing prices. And so there is increasingly a critique right now that our measure of the consumer price index doesn't actually capture the inflation of existing home prices as well as it might do. And in the process then downplays the degree to which inflation is happening with our major cost of living. And so I think there's an opportunity at the very least for Statistics Canada to start reporting annually about alternative approaches to measuring the inflation of existing housing prices, and then commenting on how monetary policy may or may not be influencing that inflation. I think just getting more information out in the short term will be the next incremental step, because monetary policy is critical and has to serve multiple goals well beyond housing, and changes in one area of the economy can be more harmful than others. And I think that right now we're going to need to try and do a little bit more like walking that tightrope. And so I'm looking for people to improve our conversation about monetary policy to downplay the collateral damage towards housing affordability.
Great, thank you. And another one on housing, Dawn asks, given that young couples planning on having children are not often interested in living in high density environments like a condo or rental, but rather looking for a house of their own, preferably with enough yard to permit play and recreation, what kind of options do you think you could propose to assist them, or do you think might exist in some of the solutions perhaps that the parties are offering in this election?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question. And the answer to that's going to depend on where you live, Dawn. And I would say the following. In urban settings, the debate is less over yards right now. The debate's actually over building units with enough bedrooms. So we build quite a lot of units that are studios and one-bedroom apartments. And that's great for people who are wanting to get into the housing market. It's great for investors at a nice price point, but it's lousy if you're wanting to raise 2 children, because then you're going to have to use a closet as the bedroom. And that's it's not a fabulous situation. And so I think the debate in our biggest urban settings is building units with enough bedrooms. And then it is likely going to be places where people are having balconies and they're going to have to go to parks more often for their yards. More in the suburban areas, and there's a greater opportunity, but we still need to be thinking about adding density in suburban areas. And I think right now, the access to ground is critical, but the access to enough bedrooms becomes equally critical. So I would say that the housing supply conversation right now still needs to tackle zoning issues, and the zoning to add density. Maybe Don would be interested in the language of the missing middle. Right now we have zoning for often single detached homes, and then we have zoning for quite a lot of density. There's still room to do something in the middle, which will cater more towards those families if the units come in at the price points. But in our urban and in some suburban settings as well, access to the ground is at a price point that's increasingly out of reach. And really more and more people are saying, can I be an owner or a renter? And then we're going to need to be building purpose-built rental units that have enough bedrooms going forward. So that I would say that's the conversation about access to the ground is a challenging one, given that we've allowed the gap between home prices and earnings to grow so large. That's the lasting legacy. Now access to the ground is unaffordable in so many city contexts. And we've had to ask younger folks to adapt. And I think we should give them credit when they are adapting. And I think that's why we need to lean into asking those who have been more fortunate, myself included, to think about how we can contribute slightly more to try and slow down home prices and to try and improve the housing available to other folks as well.
Amazing. So those are the last questions that have come in, I believe, unless Nick wants, my colleague Nick in the background wants to jump on and tell me that I've missed any. But I do believe we have gotten to the questions that have been submitted. So in our last few minutes, Paul, I just wanted to turn it back over to you. Any concluding thoughts or anything you didn't get a chance to touch on that you just want to highlight before we sign off?
Yeah, maybe a few thoughts. I think the first is I'm so excited that we're doing this. And again, just to emphasize, I'm not here to tell you who to vote for. I can give you information. Our lab can give you information about how party platforms align with the evidence about what's required to solve some big problems. And I'm also sharing, when we're doing that, some of the values that are aligning in our interpretation of what that evidence is. You can do with that information what you will. But no matter who you vote for, and whatever government is formed on September 20th, hopefully we'll know on September 20th, we're going to need to ask that government to recognize that there's what I like to call the systemic intergenerational villain with his harmful hands all over some of the systems that are driving the standard of living in this country. I've alluded to it already, but there's a common tendency for our systems in Canada right now to say, let's absorb a lot of the good things now and leave less left over for those who follow, whether it's the atmosphere's scarce capacity to absorb carbon or the wealth that can be created from our housing system, but at the cost of affordability for those who follow. Or even, we haven't talked about it actually much right now, just about the budgets. I mean, no party is proposing to balance the federal budget even 4 years from now, when none of us are expecting to be in a recession. And it's not the case that they're proposing to not balance those budgets because they are going to do historic investments to transform our economy to, become net zero really, really quickly, or to solve the housing affordability crisis. It's not these large capital investments that are driving the deficit. The deficit, coincidentally, is driven disproportionately by increases in old age security spending and increases on spending on medical care, which we disproportionately use when we are older. And then we have parties talking about, hey, maybe we should add to that with more pharmacare and long-term extended care improvements, which we saw need to happen coming out of the pandemic, and dental care, et cetera. So we see growing those things, which are often about treating problems after they set in, treat illness after the fact, and retirement income security, which is critical later in our lives. But as we're growing and improving those things, when did it become the case that Canadians were unwilling to be asked to pay for them when we're incurring the costs? When we started our medical care system and started our old age security system several decades ago, there were 7 workers for every retiree at the time. Now there are fewer than 4. Why does that matter? It matters because it means, well, my mom's demographic was working hard throughout their lives and paying taxes towards medical care and retirement income security. They were doing it at a rate that was not planning for the number of people who are retiring now. In other words, they weren't paying into the system at a level that's commensurate with what they want to draw from it now. We're starting to come to terms with that. And people want more medical care and long-term extended care, et cetera. But as we offer that, as our parties offer that to citizens, we also need to ask, how are we going to pay for it? Are we going to ask the demographic, those who are older, who are disproportionately wanting to do it, can we ask your generational cohort to help pay for it? Especially since the greatest amount of wealth is held by our older age cohorts in this country. The largest amounts of wealth are held by older Canadians. Can we ask them to tap into that wealth to pay for some of the benefits that they are wanting more of right now? Or if we don't ask that, then we leave the bills for their kids and grandchildren, or say we have less left over to invest in the things that matter to them, which has been one of the key problems for childcare until recently. There's not enough money to invest in it. Well, we've been growing other parts of our investments later in life at a relatively fast rate. And so I want to say, when you're meeting with people over the weekend before election day, ask ourselves, all of us, when did we become voters who are only willing to cast our vote if we were offered something but not asked seriously about how to pay for it? Because Gen Squeeze is here as a voice to try and say, let's not squeeze, or dare I say screw, younger Canadians here and now who are earning less, facing higher costs, get left larger debts from government and environmental debts. But I don't want us to do that to those who follow in our footsteps either. So we need to be the voice that recognizes what leaving legacies that we can be proud of, and help our parents who I know want to do that leave an equally proud legacy for their kids and grandchildren. And we have some work to do to catch up on that front. So that would be a key theme. I want to underscore that none of our platforms are advancing intergenerational fairness. That is a sign that we don't have in our cultural context a concern about intergenerational fairness. And if we don't, well, then we're not recognizing how the lack of intergenerational fairness is underscoring our problems in climate, our problems in housing, and our limited investments in families with kids. I want to slay that systemic intergenerational villain, and I want to expect party platforms to help us slay that in the years ahead.
Thanks, Paula. And on that closing note, a final question just from myself for the benefit of our listeners is, we know elections are exciting times, and the voters guide and the platform analysis is really, really helpful at this time. But following the election, what are ways to continue to be involved and to hold the parties accountable to their promises post-election?
Oh, great. Well, the first thing is we do need to have everyone show up at the ballot box because that is a great way to create political power. Politics responds to those who organize and show up, and we really measure politically who shows up on ballot day. And younger folks disproportionately need to increase this. We have been slower by comparison with our parents and grandparents at showing up at rapid rates. But thereafter, once we have showed up, then what we need to do is hold our parties to account for what they promised in their platforms. Of course, the party that wins the most seats will then become the primary point of focus. If it's a minority government, we'll then think about how we leverage the promises in the other parties to help, improve the party with the most seats in terms of what it's planning to legislate. And Gen Squeeze is going to be there to do that. We know that as soon as the election is over, the next key thing we need to do is influence the degree to which that platform shapes the next budget, which will come in 2022. We know the budgets are the most important documents that governments ever produce because they shape everything. If you care about the climate, the budget's shaping it. If you care about housing, the budget's shaping it. If you care about families, the budget's shaping it. If you care about healthcare, the budget's shaping it. And so we need to be working from literally a few weeks after the election, because we can take a break, but a few weeks after the election, we can start again and start thinking about how we are supporting the next federal government to create a budget in 2022 that will truly promote well-being faster than it thinks about treating illness after the fact, and truly promote well-being from the early years onward by investing fairly and urgently in young and old alike, and doing so in a way that will ensure we raise revenue that invites all age groups to pay a fair share for the services and benefits that we wish to use. That's how we make this country work for all generations. And I genuinely know that our political culture would want to do that, especially when they see it's being in their electoral interest. So come on, young folks, show up and vote.
Thanks so much, Paul. And just to wrap up, I do just want to thank Dr. Paul Kershaw so much for his time and expertise this afternoon. It is truly appreciated. I will encourage everyone to go check out Gen Squeeze's Voters Guide. It's incredibly detailed and thorough. A lot of the questions in there that you may have percolate are probably in there. It's a very, very in-depth analysis. So big kudos to Dr. Kershaw and his team for putting that together. It's a really excellent resource. And I will just echo Paul's last comment. Please, please, please get out and vote. If you're looking for more information on how to vote in your area, elections.ca is a great resource. I do know that this evening at 6 p.m. is the deadline to vote by mail, which I know is an option that a lot of folks are using this time around, but definitely check it out whether you want to vote by mail, vote at an Elections Canada office, or vote at a polling station in your riding. But please, please, please just get out and vote. And thank you so much for tuning in. Please join Generation Squeeze's email list if you'd like to stay up to date on future events. And we hope to see you very soon. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great afternoon.